All right, take it away.
Okay, appreciate it, Ryan. We're going to talk today about uses of manure as a replacement for some fertilizer. I realize that not all of you will have animals and have a source of manure, but many of you have neighbors that probably have asked to put manure in your field before, or really have to move their manure a great distance to use it. So we're going to talk about some ways that you might be able to take advantage of the manure nitrogen, especially. So this time of year, our manure ponds begin to fill up. We've spent the entire winter collecting manure, especially the permitted farms who can't do winter application in Ohio. But really everybody, we've collected moisture. We've started to get some rain here in the last few weeks. So our ponds begin to fill up. No matter how deep and our pits are, eventually they too fill up, and we have to move this product. I want to remind everybody about the nutrient contents that are in swine finishing manure. And I'll just use this example. You measure manure nutrients in pounds per 1,000 gallons. In this sample, we look at that nitrogen number at 37.68 total pounds of nitrogen in 1,000 gallons. So if you look at that, almost all is in the ammonium form. So if you were to put that on a crop or spittle it in your yard, it will be readily available and be used. Now, you'll burn the grass in your yard initially, but it'll come back pretty strong with spot to mow more frequently than the rest of the yard. Organic nitrogen is fairly low in swine manure. Sometimes you'll come across farmers who mix the two types of manure, dairy and swine, for example. And in that instance, it may be a little bit higher, but still plenty of nitrogen when there's a mixture of the two. And then the P2O5 and the K2O that's in swine manure is identical to what you buy when you go to a co-op to buy your fertilizer. So if you bought a ton of potash to put on alfalfa last year at 0060, then you paid for that $2,000 ton, whatever you paid for, 60% of that was the P2O5 content of that fertilizer. And then you've got all these micronutrients. Most people don't pay very much for manure, unfortunately, for the livestock producers. But when you look at all those micronutrients along with the macronutrients, manure is usually a pretty good product to look at. And then I like to remind everyone that 50% of our NP and K value is actually in that nitrogen. So if it's in the ammonium form and readily to use, then you can use it on a growing crop. If it's something that you put out in the fall, you're in Ohio, at least, we generally live by the rule that you're probably going to lose about half of that nitrogen over the course of the winter. And we'll just touch briefly on dairy manure. Same idea. The analysis that we run at Brookside or any other lab usually comes back with a total nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen and then an organic nitrogen. Now, in this situation, the ammonia and organic is split. 50% ammonia, 50% organic. But as the dairies have moved away from bedding and more, or from organic bedding and more to fertilizer and other inorganic sources of bedding, we're seeing the ammonium nitrogen percent rise in dairy manure. And it's been pretty noticeable. Sometimes I'll get as high as 18 to 20 pounds of ammonium nitrogen in dairy manure in certain situations. Again, you've got your P2O5 and your K2O. So both swine and dairy manure are pretty good sources of potash for alfalfa and other crops like that. And we always want to emphasize the balance for phosphorus anytime we're working with manure. I mean, it's a great thing. You can put on enough for 2-3 years of crop rotation, but we want to make sure we always keep in mind we don't want to build our phosphorus levels for any reason. And then you have your micronutrients in your dairy manure. And manure is also a source of sulfur, both in swine and the dairy. So just that's a nutrient that we call for a lot in soil tests that we didn't have to. Now, spring's not very far away. So there's quite a few farmers around the state that will probably do this. And this person has simply got a smaller tanker, so the compaction is not quite as big an issue. And he's simply splattering swine finishing manure on top of a wheat field. And this farmer has done this for a number of years. That's his preferred system. He's always got a wheat field someplace. He's got his buildings fairly full of manure this time of year. So he always plans to get that done. Now, putting it on top of the ground may not be your thing, but you can also look at, there's a couple commercial manure applicators that have these grassland applicators. These are just a colder, with a depth control rim on the outside of it, hooked up behind a tanker. And then when they put manure on, this applicator is putting the same amount of manure on that the previous one was splashing, only he's simply creating these knife marks through this wheat field and putting the manure directly over top those knife marks. And this is good enough on the incorporation that it's an okie dokie by the Ohio Department of Agriculture for the H2O program. So again, he could be paid $60 an acre to do this, assuming his phosphorus soil tests are in the right spot to be in that program. So give some thought to that. That's a couple methods. Another that we use quite a bit around the state is to drag hose manure on wheat. This would be a sow unit, so their application rate is somewhere around 10,000 gallons per acre. And sow manure is generally going to be lower in that ammonium nitrogen and all of your nutrients for that matter than your swine finishing manure. And I know of instances where farmers have put two applications of swine manure on wheat, spaced far enough apart because they wanted to get their total nitrogen correct. Always the big thing about wheat is you should not over fertilize wheat because that wheat will go down on you. Nobody enjoys combining fields that have gone down badly. And if you put high rates of nitrogen on wheat, you can get into that situation pretty quickly. So most wheat fields, if you're looking at swine finishing manure, you would hope you would have an analysis to work off of, but if you didn't, most swine finishing buildings might be somewhere around 4,000 gallons per acre if you're wanting to get about 120 units of nitrogen or slightly more. Now, again, it all depends on what fed. So some integrators look at cookies and other types of rations, and their manure pits may not have nearly the content that others will have. So don't guess, because you don't want to have to fly some nitrogen on these fields later after you thought you'd taken care of that. But it works pretty well economically because costs you about a penny to a penny and a quarter, maybe a gallon to have manure applied to a field. And when you're replacing fertilizer, I think the last I saw for UAN was about $3.90 a ton. So that's about 70 cents a pound for nitrogen. So you can put on the hog manure and come out money ahead. You're getting manure moved, you're getting all those other nutrients with it, and then you're saving the money on the purchase fertilizer. And this is simply a dairy that's putting manure on top of wheat. The wheat's overdue for the nitrogen. You can see it's at Feeks V7, I think, growth stage 7. And but they're putting it on with these drop nozzles, and that allows them to keep it off the leaves so that when they go to make silage or wheat haylage off of this field in a couple of weeks, they won't have to really worry about the manure itself because it's been placed on the ground with the drop nozzles. And just showing that even at V7, drag hose would go across the wheat. We didn't do any research on this. I didn't really think much that it was possible, but I was contacted by some folks from England saying, yeah, boy, we do that a lot with a drag hose at higher, greater, or more advanced wheat stages. So to watch this go across the V7 wheat and have it stand right back up was pretty neat. Of course, you're not going to do much about those tractor tracks, but again, we're putting on manure and we're getting our pits emptied and nutrient-wise, whatever nitrogen is left over will be available for the corn silage that will be in this field right after they take the wheat off. Now, many of you may have had manure applied last fall, and so I want to talk about how you might benefit yet from that. This is a fall strip till manure study that we did over 3 years. And essentially what we did is we knifed the manure in strips with the intent of planting corn directly on top of these strips the following spring. And the reason that we looked at this, Canada had done a similar study where they knifed the manure in April and came back and planted in May. And they had real problems getting decent emergence. They were left less than 50% on getting their corn to grow in that type of situation. Now, if you would move the planter over maybe 6 inches from the manure thing, perhaps it'd make it work. But it's really hard when you've knifed liquid into the ground to get that ground fit to get equipment on and to do much with. It's just the way it is, whether it's spring or even summer, we see that. So in this instance, we knifed that manure in the fall. We used 2 rates of dairy manure and 2 rates of swine manure. In the following spring, they came in and they planted directly on top of those strips. I had put orange stakes out, just curious to see if they really did hit those orange strips, and they hit every stake. They did a really good job with their global positioning equipment at the research farm. They only had it a couple of years, so really pleased with that. So we followed that and we looked at the crop. Now, the drawback of this study was that there was no starter fertilizer used any of the 3 years. So these green strips are actually the ones that got manure last fall, and the lighter yellow strips are the ones that were planted in the spring. Now, they did have the fall strip till effort, but then the corn was planted without any nitrogen from fall or spring application. And then this is the way it was until side dress time came. So when you looked at that, the purpose of the study was to see whether we had, emergence like we wanted. And the answer was yes. We did not have any stand difference between those that were planted on top of those fall nitrogen strips and those that were planted without any nitrogen. So the stands were the same. That growth stage, there was about 2 stages of difference. When one was at V4, the other would be at V6. Well, those differences in growth stage stayed with us through tasseling. You can see where the corn that received the manure strips in the fall tasseled earlier than the other corn. And I think that it just gave the corn a jump. So again, if we'd had side dress nitrogen in the planter, maybe we wouldn't have seen that, but the emergence was what I was looking for. Now, we took them to yield. And if you look at the average of the 3 years, I'm going to move my cursor. I'll maybe put this on a laser pointer. If you look, I'm going to look down here at the second line from the bottom. If we had no manure applied, the average for the 3 years was 216 bushel. Now, that was no fall manure. Everybody in the study got 200 pounds of side dress in the spring in this part of the study, simply because we only wanted to check the emergence at the time. We didn't realize we'd have 3 phenomenal growing seasons to go together like this. So the rest of these, if you look at the yields, it all depended on who had the most nitrogen, and that's how they stack up. The swine manure, when we put that on, we put 8,000 gallons on. We were pretty close to 40 pounds of available nitrogen or ammonium nitrogen in that manure. And so that one was 320 pounds of nitrogen in the fall. This one was 200. Then if you look at the dairy, because of its nitrogen content, with 12,000 gallons, it got 192 pounds of nitrogen, and this dairy one got 128 pounds. And those numbers come across all the way, and whoever had the most nitrogen won the yield contest. Now, nobody was hurting for nitrogen, because even the corn that got no starter or any fall nitrogen yielded 216. But when you look at all these other ones, that fall applied nitrogen made a pretty good spring nitrogen fertilizer starter that we could work. So how would you look at this? If you had fields that were manured last fall, you might want to give yourself some credit for the manure that was put on. Now, there's lots of factors. Was it incorporated? Was it eventually worked in? Was it left on the surface for weeks to lose ammonia? Because most of the ammonium in that manure that's lost is lost in the first few days, and then after that, it doesn't leave as fast. And we also did another part of the study that Greg Labarge was primarily in charge of, where he went into some of these plots that we didn't need for my emergence study, but they were treated the same way in the fall. And then he did this is Purdue University's PSNT chart, and he followed this. And some of our plots with the high fall nitrogen rates, if you look at the way this chart is set up, Purdue says if you have between 0 and 10 parts per million of ammonium nitrogen in your soil tests, then you need to go with your full rate of side dress fertilizer. So whatever you have between your row starter and your side dress, Purdue would say stick with that. But if you have these types of parts per million in your soil test, then you could look at backing off. So Greg was able to back off in some of these at 90 pounds of side dress per acre. others more like 45 pounds. And and it worked for us. The yields that he came up with, again, 3 really good growing seasons, were very similar to what I had in mine. Now, remember, mine all got 200 pounds of nitrogen. What Greg did is he backed off of that side rate, dress rate, and got these results. We didn't have any that held enough nitrogen to going into the following year to skip side dress nitrogen. But this PSNT test, this is something that you can get the sample to Brookside, usually within 2 days. You can get an email answer back from what they come up with in that PSNT. Just remember to pull the soil core to proper depth. For some situations, it might be 9 inches. For others, it might be 12. But you pull that full depth. You got to go deeper than a regular 6-inch soil sample when you pull those. But just look at the possibility. Especially if you've got a history of manure on the field, where you've manured that field several times in recent years, this PSNT might be able to really help a person out quite a bit on nitrogen. Now, if you look at using manure as a side dress to corn, that's not going to fit everybody because you weren't planning on it. You haven't worked anything out with your commercial manure applicators, but we'll just talk about some of the possibilities that might be. This was just research that we had done over a 5-year period of time where we compared swine finishing manure and dairy manure to 28% UAN. So the top half of this study was 28% incorporated. So there's 200 pounds per acre was the rate we used. Then we incorporated swine manure at 5,000 gallons per acre, going right down the row with that little tanker you saw in the previous picture. Then we had surface applied swine manure at 5,000 gallons per acre. Then we did we did an incorporated rate of dairy manure at 13,500 and a surface amount of 13,500. Now, neither of those would have enough nitrogen to reach my 200 pounds per acre to keep everybody even. So I had to add enough 28% to make 200 pounds based on the historic soil or manure tests that I'd used with that dairy. So we bring these across. So we had 5 years. We had 3 droughts. We had 1 great year and 1 so-so year. And when you brought them across and you looked at the averages, what we found out that the incorporated swine manure, and again, the bottom half of this chart are post-emergence. Very same treatments. Everything was the same, only we waited for the corn to come up in these plots. So the corn would have been around that V3, V4 stage. So when we looked at that, we had about a 15 bushel benefit of the incorporated swine manure capturing that ammonium nitrogen and growing that crop versus down here we had 18 pounds to the positive when we did it in the post-emergent plots. So the manure was put on at a closer time to when the corn was actually going to need that nitrogen. Now, when we left it on top of the ground, we gave back those advantages. We lost to the incorporated corn or incorporated manure, but we were still within about, when you look at the 142 for the 28% average for 5 years, you look at 131 for the swine manure average for the 5 years, we still were within about 10, 11 bushel. And the same holds true down here. We had 144 versus 137. So it wasn't ideal. It wasn't perfect, but we came reasonably close. Now, with dairy manure, if we incorporated it, we had great results. If we surface applied it, we dropped quite a bit more than that. The difference between 142 and 126 is a pretty good jump. And then the difference between a 144 and a 135 is a fairly good jump. So I'm just pointing out that at the rates we used, we did not completely match the 200 pounds of nitrogen provided by the 28%. So with this data set in mind, some farmers are using their manure using tankers, and they're applying manure with tankers and usually Dietrich sweeps, sometimes rolling coulter toolbars, and they're going down through the fields and they're side dressing their corn. You just need to do the math ahead of time and make sure you can get to the other end of the field, because you don't want to go across these fields twice with these heavy tankers. And then we like to run Dietrich sweeps behind the toolbar or behind the row or the wheel row, just to try to take out some of the compaction. In our research plots with our small university tanker that we used, We did not find that same advantage with a heavier tanker. When we ran our 5,200 gallon tanker, the one on the left, it was more like break even or slightly a bushel or two ahead of commercial fertilizer, but not the nice increase that we saw with the small plot tanker. And I think a lot of that has to do with soil compaction. So again, you can get this. The advantage of a tanker like this is to be able to get across corn that's taller than what we can do with some of our other methods of application. So if you have a neighbor who's been experimenting with this, he might always be looking for another place to move some manure. These are the rolling coulter designs that we have. The university has 3 drag hose toolbars that we've had for a number of years, but you see a wavy coulter in front of a tube placing manure and then covering wheels. And that's that's the industry trend that we've seen for a number of years to go to the wavy coulter. So it tills dirt to a depth of 2-3 inches, puts the manure on top of that loose soil, and then can have some covering effects. And if it's no till, maybe you won't cover as much, but generally that's going to take care of our wormholes and our preferential flow treatment and help us out quite a bit. This would be Herod Farms in Darke County. This is from a number of years ago when they were drag hosing a field of corn. They've done this, I think, probably 10, 12 years now, where they'll either they or they'll have a commercial applicator come in, and he's simply taking swine finishing manure and he's placing it between the corn rows at a rate of about 6,500 gallons per acre. And he did this for, I think, 6, 7 years with the university. And he would leave strips of corn that was side dressed with 28%. And when you looked at his records, his advantage of the manure over the 28% was just about identical to what our small plot research was. So that shows me, or at least it tells me, that there's a good likelihood that the drag hose does not have the compaction of a soil tanker. There are limitations here, of course. We can only go to certain size corn. V4 is about as tall as we like to go on it. But I'll show you a little bit more on that. This will be another field out of Defiance County. Light Hills have done some side dress work for a number of years with corn. And their buildings are up the top of the screen, and they simply planted their field at a 45-degree angle like the Herods do down in Darke County so that the drag hose works out. You can put that drag hose from one corner to the other at a diagonal, and then you can do one side of the field, cross over, and do the other half of the field, just like a drag hose person would do if there were no crop in the field whatsoever. So again, they made this work. They used their hose and their tractor, and the university had a toolbar that they get their hands on. And they're doing a pretty good job at 8,000 gallons per acre. And they use a higher rate because their swine manure is stored in an outside pond. So they pump from the deep pits to the outside anytime they're short of storage or anytime that they have a need to get some space in their buildings themselves. So works out well for them. And they had said at the time this was probably their best corn year of their entire lives, as everybody had a good year that year as well. Now, last year, we had a lot of trouble getting planted in Northwest Ohio and replanted in some instances. It wasn't a very good spring again for us. So this is an example of a producer who did not plant corn himself, but he told his neighbors that my pit manure is free if you'll help pay for the application cost. And that's what we did. So this corn is getting a little bit on the tall side. It's about V4. And the commercial applicator simply came in and drove across these fields and put this swine manure on. Now, we talked about how could we replace the side dress nitrogen because the corn would have gotten row starter, of course. So what they did in this situation is rather than put it on at 5,000 or 6,000 gallons per acre, they put it on at 8,000 gallons per acre, figuring that maybe we can make up that 10 bushel loss or 10, 12 bushel loss that we got when we surface applied manure or swine manure at 5,000 gallons per acre in our small plots. So that was a thought process. And I also put out a research plot this last year with the same thought in mind. Let's do some comparisons of incorporated manure and surface applied manure at higher rates. And again, these fields would have been non-manured field for many, many years. Here would be a field that was manured, has been manured for a number of years. But again, they got their corn planted. The dairy wanted space. So rather than put manure on first and then happen to wait till the field was fit, because sometimes we never know what that planting window is going to be. This is just an example where the corn is up. They just drive across it at an angle. And I came back in and looked at these fields and collected some tissue samples, both from the swine manured fields and some of these dairy manured fields, because I was curious to see. Now, what they did in this field is they still came in with side dress fertilizer, but they backed off about 40 pounds per acre, assuming that the dairy manure would make up the difference in that. Now, this field was going to go to silage, so wouldn't have a grain yield anyhow. But if you look at the average, when I look at the 4 dairy manured fields that we did, and I pulled tissue samples from the leaf tissue at pollination time, they came back at 3.31% on the nitrate nitrogen, or the nitrogen in the leaf. The normal range, according to our university bulletins, are 2.8 to 4%. So in that instance, we were sufficient in nitrogen. Now, we were in the other nutrients as well, but nitrogen was the one that we're actually looking at in particular. When we looked at the 2 swine farms that we did, we averaged those together. They came back at 3.54%. Not surprised, because you get a lot of nitrogen in that swine manure. Again, looking at typical, so that came back as sufficient. I know the farmer was pretty happy with it. He sent me pictures through the summer to let me see how well the field looked. So again, it seemed to work out well. Hopefully that'll be a good working partnership between the two at some point in the future. I just want to emphasize, if we deal with drag hosing, this is what we consider to be V3 corn. This first leaf on the right was the spike leaf that came out initially. It's kind of rounded on the end like your thumbnail is. That was your V1. This one has established a collar here, so that's V true. That's a true leaf. That's V2. This leaf too has established a collar, just like you would grip a hoe handle or a shovel handle. It's got a grip on that. So that's V3. Now, this leaf here has not yet established a collar. So this is V3 corn, kind of my favorite stage to hit corn with a drag hose if we're going to do it. And but you can still do it when you see V4 established. But the other thing you can do is you can simply step on them. If they snap when you step on them, then that means they're too tall and they're not going to come back like they should. If they just bend over and look bad, then that means they'll straighten right back up the next day and they'll be fine. But I also want to emphasize, not every field is going to be a candidate for a drag hose. This is a loamy soil. The corn's actually spiking in this field. And this is a commercial manure applicator that had done this for a number of other farmers. And he wanted to do it on his own farm because he did have a hog building. And he said he was very happy with the yield, but I think I would argue that we really moved that nitrogen around, and we're moving dirt as we scour across the field. And sometimes you can get dirt piles big enough that you'll pull your hoses apart. So you have to be kind of cautious. So always think about that field. If you deep worked it that spring and hadn't had any rainfall on it, the odds are pretty good it's going to be too soft for a drag hose to be used. But if you had stale seed bed, like we do a lot of in Northwest Ohio, if you had cover crops, guild or living, if you're no-till, all of those work pretty well for this type of stuff. Now, I would also emphasize the need to know what the quality of your manure is going to be. And that's always been on part of our Achilles heel. This is a young man, Chris Schalp, who pulled manure samples for us for a number of years. And basically, we had a collection tube on the side of one of our drag hose toolbars. And what he did is he walked along and he took samples every 20 minutes as we emptied a number of buildings over a 2-summer period of time. And what he did is he collected these samples and he sent them into Brookside. Now, we had a Harvest Lab 3000 manure sensor on this equipment. And of course, it gives you instantaneous readings continuously. And we were just trying to see not only how close it was, but more importantly, what is the consistency of our poop that we were working with. Now, this was Chris's grab samples of nitrogen. So total nitrogen grab sample results. This is the pounds of nitrogen in 1,000 gallons of 5 pits that we worked with. And then this is the time. Remember, he would pull a sample every 20 minutes. So across the bottom, 60 minutes would represent the first hour of pumping, 120 minutes would represent the second hour, and so on. For the most part, the nitrogen was reasonably standard, a little bit up and down, but reasonably good across there. And that simply means that the ammonium nitrogen hog manure is primarily in a liquid itself, not in the solids that have settled out. So if with minimal agitation, I would feel pretty confident in the nitrogen numbers in swine manure. In the phosphorus, we have a tale of two cities. On the left-hand side are pits that were agitated in advance of pumping. And you can see, again, the minutes are across the bottom, and pounds of P2O5 in 1,000 gallons is here on the vertical axis. As you look at those, there is variability, but generally they stayed reasonably the same, although the red one, I admit, got away from us. But still, it was good to see that. When you compare that to the right-hand chart, we're not agitating those pits in advance. So if you're pumping out of there, the first hour of pumping, you didn't get a whole lot of phosphorus in most of these pits, although if you were the red pit, maybe you did. But in that second hour, all of a sudden, look how much higher things went in that third hour, between hour 2 and hour 3. We got a lot of phosphorus. So if we're using a drag hose or we're tanking it out or however, we just need to understand that even though we got the nitrogen we wanted, our phosphorus could be more variable than what we'd like. So we just need to be kind of aware of that concern. So again, just, why would we not agitate? Simply because the risk to livestock and things like that. You have to have your exhaust fans running. You've got to do a good job of dropping curtains if you've got old curtain barns or whatever. So just understand that if we want to move that phosphorus, then we've got to give some thought to agitation as best we can. Now, what are other uses? One would be alfalfa. This is simply an alfalfa grower who's putting manure on between cuttings, and he's doing it kind of the old-fashioned way. He had actually overlaps quite a bit. His rates are pretty high, and these fields get burned off pretty well. But if you come back in 2 weeks, they actually look quite good. So this is one method of putting that manure on alfalfa between cuttings. Again, with that tanker and that tractor be hard on crowns, it sure would be. So something to keep in mind. But we've had guys tell us that they thought that they saw jumps of 20-25% in yield by putting manure on between cuttings. Maybe a more traditional way is to look at using the drag hose. When we're putting that on, this would be a dairy farm, whereas the last video was a hog farm. This dairy farm is simply putting on manure between cuttings of haylage or alfalfa hay and making it work out pretty well for them. So again, they're taking their time, they're putting her on, they're getting pretty good coverage of the entire field. And then when harvest time comes, usually these fields look good. They usually look better than the neighbor's fields or the fields that were not manured. And a lot of that has to do with we've had 2 dry growing seasons in a row. So the addition of almost a ½ inch of moisture in these instances is at a critical time to spur regrowth. Then there's a shot of nitrogen in that dairy manure, of course. And then when they go to harvest these things, when they look like this, when you're down into your second and third cutting of the summer, you feel pretty good about it. I just was out shooting this videotape, and I happened to notice that just as this farmer, just before the tape ends, you'll actually see the drag hose operator setting up his hose so that he can then drag this field in another day or two after the haylage has been harvested and taken out. And I'd like to comment that we'd have a mower like that when I was a kid, both the flailability and the ability to turn. I'd have been unstoppable with a hay mower, I think. So you can see the top left corner, the roll of hose is being unrolled back to the dairy. We're going to put manure on this field. So again, manure to boost yields, to boost growth, seems to work out for us. On hay, the only concern we would have would be the possibility that if this hay were baled and fed to smaller calves, you would want to make sure that Yonis was not transmitted or there's a couple other things we think about too on that. But if it's ensiled, maybe that's not as big a deal, but just understand that we don't want to wait till a week before harvest and then splatter manure on this field and then make make hay out of it and be surprised when there's a disease transfer. Now, the other thing we're using the manure for these days a lot more, and that is just to get crops to emerge. Again, with the battles that we've had with our wetter springs in recent years, some of our larger dairies have realized that they'd be further ahead to let the crops get planted and then turn the commercial manure applicator loose. As equipment has grown, we've got applicators that are routinely able to put on 2,000 gallons a minute or 2,500 gallons a minute or even more. And so, that's as we grew to 8-inch and 10-inch mains, that's quite a bit more than what we could do years ago when we had 6-inch mains. So this would be a field that was planted, and then we came right across it with liquid manure. This actually was a bean field that was a failed planting. And then they're coming across, they just drilled fresh beans in there, and they're coming across with their manure application now. Now, manure will kill emerged beans. So all beans that were up originally are not going to survive a manure application. But corn would. You can do this with corn from the day you plant it until you get up there at where the drag hose isn't going to work anymore at V4. But in these situations, this has been a very good thing for the farmers. This has added moisture to get germination and emergence of their crops, and they've been real pleased with it. They doesn't come back with any more manure in a bean field because beans, once they get about trifoliate 3, they'll tolerate manure and they'll tolerate the drag hose, but you can also stunt them pretty good. Kind of like if you remember the old Cobra herbicides and some of those ones that would really cook soybeans, that's what manure will do to them. So we don't really need to stunt them when you finally got them growing well. The other equipment that's coming along, you're seeing more of these Rain 360 units. That's something that we didn't see much of years ago, but we're seeing quite a bit more of it now, and seeing a lot of growth in that. Basically, the way these are, we've seen more and more ponds, dairy ponds, satellite ponds being put in the state. This is just one that was built, and it holds a few million gallons, and they've got a concrete runway here at the bottom to put the chopper pump in, but they really don't have an easy way for semis just to dump in. Now, here's one that I think is probably one of the best satellite ponds that I know of in the state of Ohio. And they come off the road. They can pull right up on here with a semi. They can dump off of this concrete pad that they got here. So if it dumps out the belly, they've got that covered. If it's got a tube out the side, they got that covered. If it drops off the back, they can also handle that with this pad. It's long enough to do that. So they've got a nice concrete thing that gets the manure into the pond itself. And then they've got 2 360s running in these fields in the background that are taking manure out of here. Now, the other thing they did with this pond is they've got 28 tanks back here. So because dairy manure is pretty low in nitrogen, and they have to put a lot of liquid in with those 360s to make it all flow right, they add 28%. They've got a couple little pumps here. They're adding 28 to the 360 applicators as they go across the field. And when these things do travel, again, 250 gallons a minute is about the most you can get through those. And sometimes they'll have to pump a gallon of water with a gallon of manure, or sometimes 2 gallons of water with a gallon of manure. It all depends on how thick it is. And they're pretty new as far as the technology, so they'll get this worked out. They're starting to put whir chopper pumps in the front of some of these. But you can see how these are like the Y drops that you're used to with your 28. So these are putting liquid down at the base of the corn plants as they go across the field. And they have, it all depends on what size you get, but this one in particular had 16 drop nozzles taking care of 2 rows each. Here would be the same field, the same unit, and it's got those drop nozzles. It's kind of hard to imagine them down in that cornfield, but in this instance, this machine is going in reverse because when it traveled down the field originally, it put manure on the outer 8 drop nozzles. And then when it reverses itself and travels in the exact same path back across the field at a whopping 1.5 or 2 miles an hour, then it's putting manure on the inner 8 hoses of this system. So that way it never drives in its own manure. And I saw one of these go through a pretty big water hole last summer, and it did a nice job. The diesel smoke just roared out of that thing. It tilted sideways and came right up out of there. I was pretty impressed with it. So it's a nice system. It's something that you'll see not only using it on corn, but we also are using it on grasses and hay. So this is a similar system. In this instance, this thing came down the field originally toward me and put manure in the outer 8 hoses, 4 on each side. And then when it's reversing its tracks, it's putting manure on the inner 8. And everything looks like it's doing pretty good, except there is one hose that is plugged here. I can see that. There should be manure coming out of this one, just like there is on the opposite side. So again, maintenance is just like anything else. You have to keep your eye on them, make sure they're running like you want them to. But they put this triticale will then go into corn silage after they've chopped it next spring. Then they'll put manure on the corn silage a few times, and then they'll put it again on the triticale or cereal rye in the fall. And as long as you're talking low nutrient manure, you can put multiple applications like this. And some of them can make as many as 6 passes, maybe 7 passes in a dry summer, like we've had these last 2 summers. On poultry litter, I would just throw out that there's a lot of ammonium nitrogen in poultry litter, probably upwards of, you get 25, 30 pounds in a ton of this stuff. If you had poultry litter applied last fall, you got it worked into the ground, there is going to be some nitrogen there this spring for your corn crop. Again, that PSNT would be a way of looking at that and see what you've got available at the time. So a lot of good nutrients from poultry litter. We move a lot of poultry litter in the state. I know we're battling our issues with the bird flu and stuff, but poultry litter has always been a good source. And even the litter that's going to come off of those bird flu farms is actually going to be better than normal poultry litter because there's a lot of carcasses in there. And I know the samples that they got back from the Hicksville farm 2 years ago up in Defiance, when they dealt with the issue, it was really good quality, a lot of nutrients in the litter. Your poultry litter was probably put on last fall in a fashion similar to this. And this is Innovative Ag with some of their work in probably Paulding or Defiance County or someplace. They cover a lot of acres and a lot of areas, get a lot into Indiana as well. So again, we're putting this rate here today was about 2 tons per acre. That's pretty common because the phosphorus in about 2 tons of poultry litter is just about what you need for a 2-year corn soybean rotation. Our goal, we just want to utilize that nitrogen as best we can. So if you've got the opportunity to do that, so forth, do it. I put down here, we like to bury manure if we can to help with weed control, but I don't think it's quite the issue it was a few years ago. And just be cautious about growing your P levels. Last thing, I'll just put a little pitch in here for the North American Manure Expo coming up on July 30th and 31 in Wauseon, Ohio. Ohio hosts this about every 10 years or so, so it's a chance to see some pretty big equipment. We're going to have demonstrations of liquid manure and solid manure. We'll have some safety stuff in there. We'll have some tours and some other stuff. So should be a real good program. And if you do like to follow anything on social media, I have a university Facebook page there that usually pretty dry this time of year, but we'll heat up again once we get into more application and stuff. With that concludes my talk today. If we have questions, Ryan, I'll be happy to take them, but